Hello everyone. Welcome to the training for large volume receipting. It's the day of a big special event and the development team has been wildly successful, and they come back to the office with large stacks of checks and cash and credit card transactions, all of which need to be deposited that day as is required by our accounting policies. Typically, the process that we have for receipting would require that the development team would have to sit and handwrite receipts for every single one of those transactions in order to complete the deposit. That's a huge amount of work. So what we've done to try to find a solution to that problem is to develop a system that is more efficient, which uses what's called a large volume cash log. So how does this cash log help us? Well, simply put, what the cash log does is it allows us to summarize on a log those individual transactions and to write one individual receipt for the grand total of that log, as opposed to having to do receipts for every single transaction on that log. And a log may consist of 30 or 40 individual transactions, so you can see that that can be a huge time saver. So when can you use one of these logs? Well, it's pretty simple actually. It has to do with whether or not the transactions are all related. And when I say related, from an accounting perspective, what I mean is they have to have the same coding combination. And the coding combination would be the general ledger code, location code, and service code all together. So for example, if we had a stack of checks from the pair in Orlando, and the coding for that would be the general ledger revenue account for pair to remember. The location code would be the 0200 Orlando code, and the service code would be the 17 development code. All of those checks would be coded the same exact way, so they can all be put onto a log, which is very important. So how do you do this? How do you use one of these logs? Well, it's really pretty simple. Step one is that you need to take all of those transactions you have in front of you and divide them up into 3 different groups. You're going to have a pile of cash and checks, a separate pile of MasterCard and Visa charges, and a third pile of American Express charges. Each one of these piles or groups needs to have its own separate log. And the reason for that is that if you think about it, each of these kinds of transactions are processed differently to deposit them, and the bank handles them differently. And then finally, because the bank handles them differently, in order for me to match up our transactions to the bank's transactions at the time that I reconcile the bank account, they need to be separated so that we can make that connection. So we will have a little bit of separation here in these different kinds of transactions. So for each one of the logs we have to do, the first thing we're going to do is start out by filling out the header. The header has just a couple of pieces of information. First of all, the event or program name. It does say program name because in certain circumstances there may be programs that can use this kind of a log. For example, a good program example would be the Personal Emergency Response System. That program sends out hundreds of invoices to individuals each month on the same day. And so there's a few days where a lot of people have responded and sent their checks in, and they may get 30 or 40 or even 50 checks in one day. That situation, all of those checks would be coded to the same program, same location, same service code. They could be put on a log. So there are some situations where other kinds of activities other than special events could use a log. So you would want to put down your event or program name. The date is directly below that, and that would be the current date because, as we all know, all deposits have to be made on the date of receipt. And then if it is a special event where you have to collect sales tax, specifically that happens during auctions, we need to fill in the county and the sales tax rate. And the reason we do that is so that when we fill out the tax return for sales tax, we have everything recorded correctly. Then we go to the body of the log. And the body of the log will contain individual lines for each individual transaction. And for each transaction, we need to record the name of the donor or payer, the gross amount of the sale or donation, that is the amount before tax is added on. If sales tax is applicable to that transaction, the amount of sales tax that we're charging the person. And then for the grand total, there are separate columns for you to place a total check, total cash, or total charge. And we do that so that you can get summary totals for the deposit slips when you fill them out. And then finally, there's a place in the last column for each line for you to put your initials as the person who received the funds. The next step is to get your calculator out after you've recorded each of these transactions, and get your calculator out and add up every one of the money columns, because we need grand totals for all the money columns at the bottom of the page. I'm a huge proponent of cross-checking wherever it's possible. We're all human and we make mistakes, and I, for one, like to be able to cross-check and find any errors that I've had made and correct them, and I really would recommend that you do the same. In this case, we have the opportunity to cross-check that our totals going down the page and those going across the page all match. And so what we would do is we would look at those grand totals at the bottom and add up the total amount, the gross amount that is, and the sales tax, and those two items added together must equal the grand total of all of the grand total checks, cash, and charges. If they don't match, then that means that there is a problem someplace on your document and you need to go back and find it. Once everything cross-checks, then our next step would be to actually fill out the receipt. If you're unfamiliar with receipting, there is a training available for that. I would recommend that you view that training or participate in a live training on receipting and depositing. For this particular receipt, you're going to use those grand totals at the bottom of the page to fill in the sum, the dollar amount of on the receipt. On the received from line, you will write cash log, and I would recommend putting dash whatever your program or event was so that it's very clear. And then finally, you're going to attach a copy of the log to the receipt. You're going to do that. You will need to make a copy of the log so that you have a copy attached to both the white copy of the receipt and the yellow copy. I would also, frankly, recommend that you keep a copy with your deposit book just so that you have everything together, and make sure that if there are any questions in the future that you're able to handle them. Let's take a look at a cash log. This is an Excel document, and it is available in the corporate library. You can see the header that we discussed at the top of the page, all of the individual transactions, the grand total broken down by cash, check, or charge. And then if I scroll to the bottom of the page, you can see the grand total line and the place for you to fill in the receipt number. As I say, this is an Excel document, so you can make a copy of it and fill it out online so that it's typed and easier to read, or it's also acceptable to print it out and handwrite it if necessary. As we just looked at the very bottom of the form, there is a place for you to fill in the receipt number. on that form, on that log form. I really recommend you do this because from time to time things do get separated, and it allows us to keep things together and for the auditors to see a very clear audit trail. So we really need you to fill in that receipt number at the bottom of the log. From that point, you just continue on the normal process of completing your deposit in whatever way it is appropriate based on your location and how you handle cash deposits or credit card deposits. And make sure that all of the documentation, as usual, makes its way to headquarters in the next available pouch. Resources for this training include the cash log, which is available on the corporate library. You can see below the link for that. It is in the accounting and financial folder on the corporate library in the accounting forms and procedures subfolder. If you should have any further questions about doing a large volume cash log, please don't hesitate to contact the accounting department. We would be happy to help you out. If you need information on any other training, I encourage you to look at any of the trainings on YouTube on depositing and other methods of handling these kinds of transactions. And I thank you very much for your time.